What if I told you that in some of the most uh, brutal, tightly controlled dictatorships in the modern world, the absolute ruler still actually bothers to hold legislative votes?
Right.
Like, we're talking regimes where one person very clearly holds all the cards, yet they still maintain this massive room full of politicians. They
Yeah.
still debate local laws, and they still go through the motions of passing bills. I mean, why on earth would an autocrat waste their time with a Congress or a parliament?
It sounds completely counterintuitive, doesn't it? I mean, we have this assumption that a legislature is strictly a democratic phenomenon.
Sure.
But the reality of why those rooms exist, even under a dictatorship, it really reveals the fundamental truth about how human societies are actually managed.
And that is exactly what we're pulling apart for you today.
Huh.
So welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to completely deconstruct the engine room of society.
I love that phrase, the
Yeah.
engine room.
Right. Because it's so easy to fall into the trap of viewing politics as, like, a reality television show. You see the sound bites, the pointing fingers, the elections are treated like the Super Bowl.
Oh, absolutely.
But beneath all that noise, there is this incredibly complex machine running. There's a system of gears and rules and mathematical formulas quietly dictating the terms of your everyday life.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
So today we are taking a massive stack of political science research, specifically focusing on the mechanics of legislatures from Chapter 9 of our source text, and we're going to explore what actually happens in the room where it happens.
Yeah.
We'll look at what these bodies do, who gets to sit in the chairs, and why they might actually be surrendering their power in the 21st century.
And, the engine room is really the perfect way to frame it, because whether we are analyzing the United States Congress or your local city council or a provincial parliament in Canada.
Or even something huge like the European Parliament.
Exactly. These are the factories where the raw, kind of chaotic energy of public demand is converted into the structure of your reality.
Right.
Trade, migration, healthcare, what you are legally allowed to build on your own land. I mean, the parameters of your life are manufactured in these deliberative bodies. And the most fascinating part is that the physical and structural rules of the machine actually dictate the final product.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because basically, if you change the shape of the room, or like the voting math, you completely change the laws that come out the other side.
I do, completely.
So let's start at the absolute foundation here. What does this machine actually do on a random Tuesday morning?
Right.
Because the baseline definition we have is that a legislature is a deliberative body granted the authority to create laws to govern a society.
Right.
But calling it a law factory feels a little, I don't know, too simplistic. It's not just an assembly line.
No, not at all. It's much more of a highly dynamic ecosystem. I mean, the primary function is, of course, creating public laws to solve emerging problems. And when political scientists say public laws, they mean these sweeping pieces of legislation that govern the relationship between the state and the individual.
Like the Affordable Care Act.
Yes, exactly. Think about the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act in the U.S. That wasn't just a minor tweak to a budget, right? It was a massive structural overhaul of a system that impacted essentially every citizen and, 1/6 of the national economy.
Oh, yeah.
But alongside writing those massive pieces of code for society, legislatures are constantly evaluating existing arrangements. They're like a diagnostic system.
Checking to see if a law from 20 years ago is failing now.
Right. And they are also the primary communication node for constituents, keeping a pulse on public sentiment. And perhaps most crucially, they oversee the executive branch to make sure the will of the people isn't being ignored by the bureaucracy.
I want to focus on that lawmaking process first, though, because it doesn't just materialize out of thin air.
Wait.
There's this misconception that politicians are just sitting in a room, inventing ideas. But looking at the research, the origin point for legislation is incredibly scattered.
Oh, it comes from everywhere.
Right. An idea might spark because a constituent literally walks into a district office and says, hey, we need funding for this crumbling local school. Or maybe an investigative journalist uncovers some horrific loophole in water safety regulations, and suddenly there's a huge public outcry.
Yeah, the inputs are endless. You have interest groups constantly walking the halls with fully drafted policy solutions, just looking for a buyer.
Just handing them out.
Basically, yeah. And you have the executive branch Presidents, prime ministers, governors routinely handing over their own agendas because they need the legislature's authority to actually fund them.
Right, the power of the purse.
Exactly. And you have the lawmakers themselves. I mean, many of them develop highly specialized passions. You might have a representative who spent 30 years as a pediatrician before running for office.
So they're just relentlessly focused on early childhood health metrics.
Precisely. They have their own internal drive.
But having a good idea or even a popular idea, it doesn't make it a law. You need someone to actually, like, push the boulder up the hill. And in this system, that person is the sponsor, right?
Yes, the sponsor.
Now, I always assumed the sponsor just sort of slapped their name on a bill for the PR, like, look what I did. But it's a much more grueling operational role, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The sponsor is really the project manager of that specific piece of legislation. They don't just introduce it, they are entirely responsible for its survival. They are the ones taking meetings with skeptics in their own party, doing all that horse trading behind closed doors, whipping up co-sponsors to show that the bill has momentum.
So they're really in the weeds.
Very much so. If the bill hits a roadblock in a committee, the sponsor has to negotiate the compromise. And once a sponsor actually introduces the text, the legislature moves into the information gathering phase.
Right.
Because despite what the public might think, lawmakers rarely legislate in a total vacuum. They hold hearings.
And hearings aren't just about collecting data, right? Because, I mean, they could just read a report for that.
Yeah.
There seems to be this psychological and political mechanism at play when you haul experts and victims and stakeholders into a public room with cameras.
Precisely. Hearings serve a dual purpose. Yes, they bring specialized knowledge into the room, which forces lawmakers to look at the unintended consequences of a drafted bill.
Which is important.
Very. But they also serve as a public stage to build consensus. When you broadcast a hearing featuring, really compelling expert testimony or emotional appeals from citizens directly impacted by a problem, you are defining the narrative.
You're putting a face to it.
Exactly. You are showing the rest of the legislature and the voting public why this specific problem must be solved right now.
Okay, so the sponsor builds the narrative, the committee holds the hearings, and eventually the bill hits the floor for a debate.
Right.
And this is the part we always see on the news, which often looks like utter chaos, just people shouting across aisles. But underneath that, there is a very rigid scaffolding called parliamentary procedure.
Yes.
And these rules fascinate me because they seem designed to protect the very people who are about to lose.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. For instance, these procedures almost universally guarantee the right of the minority party to speak. Why bother giving them the microphone if the majority already has the math to crush them?
Because legitimacy is the currency of a legislature. If a majority simply locks the doors, refuses to let the opposition speak, and just passes a law in secret, the public will view that law as fundamentally illegitimate.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Parliamentary procedures, like guaranteeing minority speaking time, mandating that every member has the right to cast a recorded vote, and strictly addressing only one piece of business at a time, it all creates a predictable, transparent crucible.
So everyone sees it happening.
Right. Even if the minority knows for a fact they are going to lose the vote, the rules guarantee them a venue to articulate their opposition, to get their objections on the public record, and to signal to their voters back home that they fought the fight.
It maintains the stability of the institution itself.
It does. It keeps everyone bought in.
It keeps the losers bought into the system so they don't just, take to the streets.
Exactly.
But eventually, the talking stops and the math takes over. And this is where we have to talk about the concept of majority rule versus supermajorities. Because for everyday, ordinary laws, the standard operating procedure is 50% plus one.
Simple majority.
Right. But the architecture changes dramatically when the stakes are raised.
It changes because the system recognizes that some decisions are too fundamental or, too difficult to reverse to be decided by a razor-thin temporary majority.
Right.
For those major actions, legislatures employ supermajority rules. This means you need a much higher threshold, 3/5, 2/3, or even 3/4 of the members to agree.
And the research highlights some incredible global examples of this. Like, look at Japan. Following World War II, their constitution established a strictly pacifist stance, famously renouncing war in Article 9.
Yes.
If a political movement in Japan wants to amend that constitution today, they can't just win a narrow election. They need the support of 2/3 of the members in both chambers of their national legislature at the Diet, Plus, they have to win a simple majority in a national public referendum.
Right. It's an intentionally massive hurdle.
Just huge.
And you see similar mechanisms in the United Kingdom regarding the fundamental structure of their government to dissolve parliament early and trigger snap elections, which is a move that throws the entire nation into political upheaval.
Yeah, it's huge.
The Fixed-Term Parliaments Act historically required a two-thirds supermajority for that. Or look at the American impeachment process.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
The House of Representatives acts as the grand jury, right? They only need a simple majority to impeach, which essentially just means sending the case to trial.
Yeah.
But to actually convict a sitting president and remove them from power, the Senate requires a two-thirds supermajority. The underlying logic is that overturning a democratic election and removing a head of state must be born of undeniable, broad consensus, not just partisan math.
Right, but I'm going to push back on that logic for a second, specifically regarding the U.S. Senate, because the theory of supermajorities makes sense for constitutional amendments or removing a president.
Sure.
But the U.S. Senate uses this procedural quirk, the filibuster, that essentially enforces a supermajority for almost everything.
Yes, it does.
I mean, the way I understand it, the filibuster is this tradition of unlimited debate. A single senator can take the floor and say, I am not done talking about this, which prevents the bill from ever being voted on.
That's right.
And the only way to make them sit down is a cloture motion, which requires 60 out of 100 senators to agree.
Your understanding is completely accurate.
Okay, so if I can use an analogy here, because I love analogies, it feels like being in a massive group project in college.
Right.
The syllabus clearly states that if half the group agrees on the final draft, you can turn it in.
Yeah.
But one guy in the group realizes he can just keep talking about the font size for 3 weeks straight, and the professor won't accept the paper until he stops talking.
Right.
And the only way to physically take the microphone out of his hand is if 60% of the group teams up against him. Doesn't that just fundamentally break the concept of majority rule? Like, isn't deliberation in this case just a polite word for obstruction?
Well, it is the ultimate tension in legislative design. It's the battle between efficiency and deliberation.
Okay.
You are absolutely right that a simple majority rule is ruthlessly efficient. 51 votes, the law passes, society moves on.
Yeah.
But rules that allow for unlimited debate prioritize deliberation to an extreme degree.
Yeah, I'd say extreme.
Proponents of the filibuster argue that it forces the majority to seek compromise. It prevents a narrow 51-vote majority from steamrolling a massive, highly ideological agenda down the throats of the other 49% of the country.
But the data suggests it just grinds the machine to a halt, doesn't it?
It undeniably causes gridlock. When you mandate a de facto 60-vote threshold for everyday legislation in a highly polarized environment, you're almost guaranteeing that sweeping, transformative public laws cannot pass.
No.
The machine is essentially trading the ability to solve urgent problems for the guarantee that minority voices cannot be ignored. It's a structural choice.
Which brings us all the way back to the hook we started with. Because democratic legislatures might struggle with gridlock, but authoritarian regimes don't have that problem.
Oh, they don't.
They have absolute power. Yet, as political scientists have documented extensively, dictatorships, from Russia to China to various Middle Eastern autocracies, still maintain expansive legislatures. Why?
Because absolute power is exhausting, and it is inherently unstable.
Exhausting how?
Well, an autocrat cannot personally manage the daily grievances of millions of people. Legislatures in authoritarian systems are not independent, obviously. They cannot defy the dictator on core regime survival issues.
Right, they'd be removed. Or worse.
Exactly. But they serve incredibly vital functions for the autocrat. First, the data shows that regimes with legislatures tend to survive longer and remain more stable than those that rule purely by decree.
Because it creates a pressure valve.
Exactly. Even in a dictatorship, different societal factions, business owners, agricultural workers, religious groups, they all have competing interests.
Sure.
If they have no venue to voice those interests, their frustration builds in the dark until it explodes into rebellion. A legislature provides a controlled environment where these groups can debate, advocate, and feel like they have a stake in the system, even if the final parameters are set by the autocrat.
It's like a massive national suggestion box.
That's a great way to put it.
It gives the illusion of influence to keep people pacified. But there's a practical administrative angle too, right?
Yeah.
Because the dictator doesn't want to spend their morning figuring out the zoning laws for a new suburban strip mall.
Precisely. The dictator uses the legislature for legislative delegation on minor issues. The autocrat dictates the macro policy, military posture, foreign alliances, major economic directives, and delegates the mind-numbing minutia of daily governance to the legislature.
Right.
It keeps the state functioning smoothly while preserving the dictator's energy and focus for maintaining absolute control.
So whether you are in a vibrant democracy or a managed autocracy, you still have hundreds of ambitious people in a room trying to process a mountain of work.
Yes.
How do they actually organize that chaos?
Ah.
The research points to two foundational structures: political parties and committees.
Yeah.
Let's tackle parties first.
Okay.
In a majority rule system, political parties aren't just ideological clubs, right? They are mathematical survival mechanisms. The party that can string together 50% plus one seat becomes the majority party.
And to the victor goes the spoils.
Exactly. They get to dictate the schedule, they decide which bills see the light of day, and they chair the committees. The minority party is left to basically play defense. But things get incredibly messy when the math doesn't result in a clear winner.
And that is actually the norm in many parliamentary systems around the world.
Wait, really? The norm?
Yes. When you have 5, 6, or 7 viable political parties, it is very rare for one single party to capture an absolute majority of the seats. When that happens, the legislature is essentially hung, and they must form a coalition government.
I want to look closely at the 2020 Irish elections for this, because it perfectly illustrates the ideological gymnastics required to make a coalition work.
It really does.
In their lower chamber, the Dáil Éireann, no single party secured a majority.
Yeah.
The party with the most votes, Fianna Fáil, realized they were mathematically stuck. They couldn't pass a single budget or law alone, so they had to sit at a negotiating table with Fine Gael. Now, historically, these two parties have been bitter rivals dating back to the Irish Civil War. It would be like asking two opposing sports teams to share a locker room and a head coach.
And to make the math work, they also had to bring in the Green Party.
Oh, wow.
So you have 3 distinct political organizations, each with their own promises to their voters, having to hash out a shared program for government. They literally have to sit down and write a massive contract detailing exactly what laws they agree to pass together over the next few years.
But the research emphasizes how fragile these coalitions are, because you aren't just managing the egos of your own team anymore.
It's a perpetual hostage situation.
Hostage situation.
It really is. If the Green Party decides that the coalition's new environmental policy isn't aggressive enough, they can simply threaten to walk away.
And then what?
If they withdraw their support, the mathematical majority collapses instantly. The government falls, the prime minister usually has to resign, and the country is frequently thrown into snap elections.
Just from one party leaving.
Right. Coalition management requires a level of constant high-stakes diplomacy that isn't required when a single party holds the majority.
Man, once the power dynamic is settled, though, they actually have to read the bills. And the sheer volume of information a modern legislature processes is staggering.
Oh, it's impossible.
You're voting on AI regulation on Monday, agricultural subsidies on Tuesday, and complex pharmaceutical biochemistry on Wednesday. No single human brain can master all of that. So they break the room down into specialized committees.
Committees are the actual workhorses of the legislature. By dividing the membership into smaller groups focused on specific policy areas, like defense, health, or transportation, lawmakers can develop deep specialized expertise.
Right.
But committees also facilitate a concept known as legislative delegation, which is arguably the most important survival tactic for a politician.
Let me test a theory here on how legislative delegation works in practice. Let's say I'm a lawmaker. I sit on the transportation committee. I know exactly how much concrete costs per ton, and I know how to fix a bridge.
Okay.
But today, the bell rings, and I have to go to the floor to vote on a 1,200-page bill regulating the algorithmic trading of derivatives in the stock market.
You're out of your depth.
Completely. I haven't read it. I wouldn't understand it if I did. So instead of throwing a dart at a board, I look across the room at a colleague from my own political party who sits on the finance committee.
Yes.
I trust them because we share the same general worldview. If they give me a thumbs up, I vote yes. If they give me a thumb down, I vote no. I am delegating my intellectual responsibility to them. Is that accurate?
That is an absolutely flawless description of the mechanism.
Right.
Legislative delegation relies on the party label acting as a heuristic.
Like a shortcut.
Exactly, a shortcut for trust. You are trusting that your party specialist has done the grueling work of analyzing the bill, fielding the lobbyist pitches, and determining that it aligns with your shared political ideology. Without legislative delegation, the information overload would paralyze the machine instantly.
But the capacity of a legislature to actually do this deep analytical work varies wildly depending on whether they are treated as professionals.
It does.
We tend to view all politicians as living these lavish full-time political lives, but that's a massive misconception, especially at the subnational level. The difference between a professional legislature and a non-professional or citizen legislature is staggering.
The contrast is immense, and it fundamentally alters who holds the real power.
Let's hear it.
Let's look at a highly professionalized body like the California State Assembly. They operate on a full-time basis. They are in session nearly year-round.
Like a normal job.
Exactly. And because it is a full-time commitment, they are paid a professional salary, around $115,000 a year, plus living per diems. But more importantly, they are given massive budgets to hire dedicated expert staff. They have lawyers, economists, and researchers working directly for them to draft laws and analyze data.
And then you contrast that with the state of Texas.
Oh, Texas is fascinating.
The Texas legislature is the poster child for the non-professional model. They only meet for 140 days, and they only meet in odd-numbered years.
Yes.
For the entirety of an even-numbered year, the Texas legislature just doesn't exist in a formal session. And they're paid $7,200 a year. That's not a typo, $7,200.
Which means they literally cannot survive without holding down a primary career outside of politics.
Right.
The proponents of this non-professional model argue that it is a brilliant safeguard. It limits government overreach because they simply don't have the time to pass a mountain of regulations. It saves taxpayer money.
Sure.
And it forces lawmakers to remain connected to the real world. I mean, they have to run businesses, practice law, or teach school to pay their mortgages.
Hold on. I'm going to push back on that being a safeguard.
Oh.
Because if the legislature packs up and goes home for 18 months, someone still has to run the state of Texas. Doesn't this system just accidentally create an incredibly imperial governor? Like, if an emergency happens, a hurricane, a grid failure, a pandemic, the governor is the only one left minding the store with any authority.
You've zeroed in on the exact critique political scientists make, but I would argue it's not accidental. It is an intentional feature of the design.
Really?
In systems with non-professional legislatures, the executive branch inevitably becomes dominant. In Texas, the governor holds immense sway, not just because they are the sole decision maker during the interim, but because of how they can control the legislature when they return.
How so?
The Texas governor has the exclusive power to call special sessions. If the legislature fails to pass a budget in their 140 days, the governor can call them back for 30 days. And the governor dictates the exact specific topics they are legally allowed to debate during that special session.
Wow. So by starving the legislature of time and money, you make them entirely reliant on the executive branch or on corporate lobbyists just to get the information they need to function. It completely tips the scales.
It does. It shifts the center of gravity entirely.
Which transitions perfectly into our next core question. Who actually gets to sit in these seats? We've looked at the architecture of the room, but the art of representation is about who the machine is actually working for.
Right.
Every lawmaker represents constituents. But how those constituents are grouped together, the geographic boundaries, it changes the entire psychology of the politician. Let's look at the Canadian model versus the Israeli model.
This is the debate between geographic representation and national representation.
Okay.
In Canada, the system is fiercely geographic. The country is carved up into specific districts, which they call ridings. If you are a member of parliament for a riding in Halifax, Nova Scotia, your entire political survival depends on the voters inside those specific borders.
So you only care about them.
Right. You are deeply incentivized to fight for local concerns. If the local shipyards need federal contracts, you become a relentless champion for maritime funding.
But the danger there is extreme tribalism, right?
Yeah.
You end up with hundreds of politicians bickering over the national budget, trying to siphon off cash to build a bridge in their hometown just to win re-election, even if that bridge isn't in the national interest. It's classic pork barrel spending.
Exactly. And that is why countries like Israel and Mozambique take the exact opposite approach. They don't use local geographic districts at all.
None.
None. The entire nation is treated as one single massive electoral district. When a voter goes to the polls in northern Israel or southern Israel, they are looking at the exact same national list of candidates.
So a politician in Israel can't campaign on promising a new highway for a specific town because that town only makes up a fraction of a percent of their overall electorate.
Exactly. They are forced to campaign on broad, national, ideological platforms.
Yes, it eliminates local geographic tribalism.
It does. But the trade-off is a massive centralization of power in the hands of political party bosses.
Why is that?
Because voters are essentially voting for a party brand rather than a local community leader they know personally. So the party leadership gets to dictate who is placed high up on the candidate list. The accountability shifts from the local town hall to the national party headquarters.
Even if a country does choose to use geographic districts, there's another mathematical fork in the road. Single-member versus multi-member districts.
Right.
In the U.S., the House of Representatives is entirely single-member. The map is drawn, and there is one winner per district. It's Highlander rules. There can be only one.
That's right.
But look at Denmark. Their parliament, the Folketing, relies on multi-member districts, and the math here is just fascinating.
Denmark scales the representation based on the size of the constituency. The research highlights the island constituency of Bornholm. It's relatively small, with around 31,000 voters. It gets 2 seats in the parliament. In a recent election, the math shook out so that Denmark's Liberal Party won 1 seat and the Social Democrats won the other. But then you look at a massive constituency like Zeeland, which has over 600,000 voters. Zeeland is awarded 20 seats.
And those 20 seats aren't just won by one mega-party. They're divided up proportionally. 8 different political parties took home a slice of those 20 seats based on their share of the vote in that region.
Which brings us to the core reason why political scientists obsess over these districting rules. Diversity of representation.
Yes.
How do we ensure that the legislature actually reflects the complex tapestry of the society it governs? The data shows that single-member districts and multi-member districts achieve different types of diversity.
I want to dig into that data because the historical baseline for almost every legislature on Earth is pretty grim. They have historically been dominated by older, wealthy men of the majority race.
That is the historical reality. But the trends are shifting. In the U.S. Congress, if you look at the 2 decades between 2001 and 2021, the percentage of members identifying as people of color doubled, rising from 12% to 24%.
That's significant.
And the percentage of women also doubled, going from 13% to 27%. Globally, we see a similar trajectory. Between 2008 and 2019, the global average for women holding legislative seats grew from 18% to 24%. We are still nowhere near parity, but the demographic face of the engine room is changing.
And the research indicates that the districting math plays a role here. Single-member districts, like in the U.S., they are often highly effective at ensuring representation for racial and ethnic minorities, but only if those communities are geographically segregated and clustered together.
Right, allowing them to form a majority in that specific district and elect a candidate from their own community.
But multi-member districts, like Denmark's 20-seat behemoth, are proven to be much more effective at electing women. Why is the map better for gender parity?
Because of how political parties manage risk. Yes. In a single-member, winner-take-all district, a political party has to put all its chips on one candidate. Historically, risk-averse party bosses defaulted to running traditional establishment men.
Sure, the safe bet.
But in a multi-member district where a party might be running a slate of 5 or 6 candidates to win multiple seats, the calculus changes. The party wants the slate to appeal to as broad a base as possible, so they intentionally balance the ticket with women and diverse candidates.
Which brings up a critical conceptual distinction in the research. Descriptive representation versus substantive representation. Because some people argue, who cares what the politician looks like as long as they vote the way I want?
Right.
That is the argument for substantive representation, right?
Correct. Substantive representation focuses purely on ideology and policy outcomes. If you are a working-class voter who prioritizes union protections and your representative fights tirelessly for union protections, they are substantively representing you, regardless of whether they show your gender, your race, or your economic background.
Okay, and descriptive.
Descriptive representation, however, argues that demographic identity and lived experience matter profoundly. It is the idea that the legislature should physically look like the population it serves.
And it's not just about optics. The data bears this out. Sharing a lived experience fundamentally alters what a politician perceives as a priority.
Absolutely.
If you elect a woman whose parents were political refugees, her visceral internal understanding of immigration policy and the social safety net is fundamentally different from a man whose family has been wealthy and established for 5 generations.
Yes.
The research shows that descriptive representation significantly boosts the probability that a marginalized group's highly specific, nuanced interests will actually be brought to the floor. When women entered legislatures in higher numbers, we saw a measurable increase in the prioritization of issues like maternal health, childcare, and family leave. The identity shapes the agenda.
It absolutely does. But regardless of their identity, once a politician takes the oath of office, they face a paralyzing philosophical dilemma.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Who are they actually supposed to be in that room? This is a debate that dates back to the 18th century political philosopher Edmund Burke.
Right.
He was serving as a member of parliament for Bristol, and he crystallized the tension between two distinct modes of behavior, the delegate and the trustee.
Let's unpack Edmund Burke's headache, because it is the exact same headache every modern politician has today.
It really is.
The delegate model is exactly what it sounds like. You are a highly paid messenger pigeon. Your only job is to aggressively poll your constituents, figure out exactly what the majority of them want, and vote for it.
Exactly.
You leave your personal conscience and your personal opinions at the door. If your voters want to build a coal power plant in the middle of a nature reserve, and you personally think it's an ecological disaster, it doesn't matter, you vote for the coal plant.
The delegate model operates on the assumption that the voters are informed, engaged, and capable of making complex macro policy decisions.
It's just a big assumption.
Yeah.
Very big. The trustee model is the exact inverse. The trustee model argues that the voters did not elect a messenger pigeon. They elected a human brain.
Right.
They elected you to use your judgment, to study the briefings, and to make the hard decisions that are in the long-term best interest of the society, even if the voters vehemently oppose it in the short term.
Burke leaned heavily toward the trustee model, right? He famously told his voters in Bristol that his judgment was a trust he owed to them, and he would be betraying them if he sacrificed it to their immediate opinions.
Yes, he did.
And there is a phenomenal example in the research regarding modern American politics that proves why the trustee model is sometimes the only way a country can function.
Foreign aid.
Oh, foreign aid is the ultimate case study in the information gap between voters and lawmakers.
Oh, so.
Well, if you conduct a poll of the American public today and ask them about foreign aid, a massive bipartisan majority will confidently tell you that the United States spends vastly too much on foreign aid. They perceive it as a massive drain on the federal budget.
Right. People assume we're just shipping pallets of taxpayer cash overseas while roads crumble at home. They think it's 20 or 30% of the budget.
Exactly. But the empirical reality is that foreign aid accounts for roughly 1% of the total U.S. federal budget. It is a rounding error.
1%.
Yes. And yet it maintains broad support among the actual legislators in Congress. Why? Because the legislators are operating as trustees.
They know the truth.
They do. They have access to the classified briefings. They sit down with military generals and diplomats who explain that this 1% investment is actually a highly efficient mechanism for purchasing global stability, projecting soft power, and preventing conflicts that would cost trillions of dollars if the military had to intervene.
So the politicians know the truth, but the public is operating on a myth.
And here is the kicker. When researchers actually inform the public, when they sit voters down and say, hey, it's only 1%, public opinion violently swings. Suddenly, the majority says that 1% is either the right amount or even too little. The trustee model is necessary because lawmakers are navigating a landscape of classified information and extreme complexity that the average voter simply does not have the bandwidth to process.
I love thinking about this through the lens of hiring a doctor.
Okay, let's hear it.
When you go to the doctor, which model do you want them to use? You want a delicate doctor, you walk in and say, my knee hurts, I want a prescription for gummy vitamins and a lollipop.
Right.
And the delicate doctor says, you're the boss. Here are your gummies. That sounds great, right up until your knee falls off from an untreated infection.
Exactly.
A trustee doctor looks at your chart, ignores your request for candy, and says, no, you need a grueling, painful surgery and 6 months of physical therapy. You are going to hate me for it, but it is the medicine you need to survive.
Yeah.
We demand that our doctors act as trustees, yet we are constantly outraged when our politicians attempt to do the exact same thing.
That analogy perfectly captures the friction. And the truth is, pure delegates and pure trustees rarely survive in the wild. The research identifies a third path, the Politico model. Most lawmakers are chameleons. They balance the two.
Let me guess. They are delegates when people are screaming and trustees when everyone is asleep.
Precisely. If an issue is highly visible, emotionally charged, and dominating the local news, the lawmaker leans heavily into the delegate role. They vote with the mob to ensure their own political survival at the next election.
Sure.
But on highly obscure technical issues, like adjusting the amortization schedules for municipal bonds where the public has zero interest, they lean into the trustee role and rely on their own expertise.
And we can't ignore the fourth model, which feels increasingly dominant today, the partisan model.
Yeah.
In this scenario, the lawmaker essentially views their primary relationship not as being with the voters, but with the political party. They operate on the assumption that the voters elected them specifically to be a loyal foot soldier for the party brand. Therefore, voting the party line, regardless of their own judgment or local polling, is fulfilling their duty to the electorate.
Right.
So we've covered the mechanics of the room and the psychology of the people inside it. Now we need to zoom out and look at the macro power dynamics. How does the legislature connect to the rest of the government? Who actually holds the steering wheel?
Okay.
The research divides the world primarily into presidential systems and parliamentary systems, with a fascinating hybrid in between. Let's start with the presidential system, because it is the framework Americans intuitively understand. The defining characteristic here is a rigid constitutional separation of powers.
The separation is the point. In a presidential system, the electorate votes for the legislature in one election, and they vote for the executive, the president, in a completely separate election. The two branches have separate mandates from the people. The legislature's job is to write the laws, and the president's job is to execute them. The president is not a member of the legislature and cannot simply dictate what laws they pass.
The president does have a veto pen, which acts as a massive check on the legislature's power, but they can't force a bill to the floor. And the founders of the American system designed it this way intentionally to prevent tyranny. They wanted the branches to fight each other. But the side effect of that design is intense gridlock, right?
Gridlock is a feature, not a bug, of the presidential system.
A feature.
Yes. If the voters elect a president from one political party, but elect a legislature controlled by the opposing party, you have a recipe for systemic paralysis. The two branches essentially block each other, and sweeping national change becomes nearly impossible.
Now compare that engineered friction to the ruthless efficiency of a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary democracy, there is no separation of powers. The executive and the legislative branches are structurally fused together.
It is a totally different paradigm. In a parliamentary system, the voters only cast one ballot. They elect the members of the legislature.
Right.
Once the legislature is seated, the political party that holds the majority of the seats gets to select the executive, which is usually called the prime minister.
So the prime minister is literally born out of the legislature. They are a sitting member of parliament who has just been elevated by their peers.
Exactly. And this creates profound efficiency. Because the prime minister is the chosen leader of the majority party in the legislature, they almost never face gridlock. If the prime minister introduces a core piece of their agenda, it is practically guaranteed to pass because their party controls the voting math. There is no independent executive veto to worry about.
But that efficiency comes at the cost of stability, right?
Yeah.
Because what the legislature gives, the legislature can take away.
That is the ultimate vulnerability. The prime minister's power is entirely conditional on maintaining the confidence of that legislative majority.
Right.
If the prime minister makes a wildly unpopular decision, or if a coalition partner defects, like we discussed with the fragile Irish model, the legislature can hold a vote of no confidence.
And if they lose?
If the prime minister loses that single vote, their government collapses instantly. They are stripped of power, and it usually triggers sudden snap elections across the entire country.
It's high-stakes efficiency. And then you have countries that look at both models and say, let's try to combine them. The semi-presidential system, France and Sri Lanka are prime examples here. They elect a powerful, independent president to serve as the head of state, but they also have a prime minister who is responsible to the legislature.
It's an attempt to capture the stability of an independent executive and the legislative efficiency of a prime minister.
Does it work?
Well, the president usually handles macro issues like foreign policy and defense, while the prime minister handles the day-to-day domestic agenda. But it can lead to intense turf wars if the president and the prime minister belong to opposing political parties, a situation the French call cohabitation.
Okay, so regardless of whether you are in a presidential or parliamentary system, the politicians have to get into the room somehow. And the mathematical formulas used to count the votes fundamentally alter the reality of the country's politics.
They absolutely do.
We touched on this with districting, but let's dive deep into the two primary electoral systems, proportional representation and plurality voting. Proportional representation, or PR, is a system driven by pure math. The core philosophy is that the share of the votes your party receives nationwide should exactly equal the share of the seats you get in the legislature.
Brazil is a phenomenal case study for PR. In their national congress, they allocate seats to each state based on population size, ranging from 8 seats for smaller states up to 70 seats for massive states like São Paulo.
Okay.
But within those states, the seats are awarded proportionally. If a political party wins roughly 30% of the popular vote in São Paulo, the math dictates they are awarded roughly 30% of São Paulo's 70 seats.
It sounds incredibly fair. It means the legislature acts as a precise mirror of the public's diverse viewpoints. But there is a chaotic downside to pure math, right? If you need just 1% of the vote to win a seat, you could end up with 50 fringe, extremist micro-parties paralyzing the parliament.
Which is exactly why almost every PR system incorporates a minimum threshold. In Brazil, they implemented reforms requiring parties to hit a minimum floor, often around 3 to 5% of the national vote, just to qualify for any seats. It is a deliberate mechanism to weed out the extreme, hyper-fragmented fringe parties and ensure the legislature can actually function.
Now, contrast that mathematical mirroring with the system used in the US and the UK. Plurality voting, often called first past the post. This is a winner-take-all blood sport. You don't get a percentage of a seat. You win the whole thing, or you get nothing.
Right.
And the craziest part is you don't even need a majority of the people to support you. You just need more votes than the next person. I want to highlight a mind-bending example of this from the 2020 U.S. Senate race in Minnesota.
Okay, this is a good one.
Tina Smith, a Democrat, was defending her seat against a Republican challenger, Jason Lewis. When the votes were counted, Tina Smith won the election. But she only received 48.74% of the vote.
She did not have the support of the majority of the state.
Exactly. Over 51% of the voters in Minnesota looked at the ballot and chose someone other than the winner.
Yeah.
Jason Lewis got 43.5%. But the math was skewed by third parties. You had a candidate from the Legal Marijuana Now party who pulled in nearly 6%, and a candidate from the grassroots Legalized Cannabis Party who took almost 2%.
Wow.
Those third parties siphoned off just enough votes to prevent anyone from crossing the 50% threshold. But because Tina Smith had the highest single plurality, she took 100% of the power for that seat.
It is a stark example of how winner-take-all mechanics can distort the ultimate will of the majority. And it's why some countries, like South Korea, have tried to engineer a compromise with a mixed system.
Now, how does that work?
South Korea's National Assembly has 300 total seats. The vast majority, 253 seats, are elected using the brutal winner-take-all plurality system in local districts.
But then they hold back 47 seats as a corrective measure, right?
Exactly. Those remaining 47 seats are distributed nationally using proportional representation. They act as a mathematical shock absorber.
A shock absorber.
Yeah. If a political party wins 40% of the national popular vote, but they got crushed in the winner-take-all local races and only won 20% of the district seats, the Electoral Commission uses those 47 PR seats to bump them up, ensuring the final makeup of the assembly closely aligns with the actual national mood.
That brings us to one of the biggest mysteries in American politics. Every election cycle, people complain about the Democrats and the Republicans. Polling constantly shows that voters desperately want a viable third party, yet third parties almost always fail spectacularly in the U.S., whereas in PR systems like Europe, you see 5 or 6 parties thriving. Why is the American system seemingly immune to third parties?
It is not a mystery to political scientists. It is a mathematical inevitability known as Duverger's law. Maurice Duverger theorized that any system that combines plurality, winner-take-all voting with single-member districts will inherently, inevitably collapse into a two-party system.
Walk me through the psychology of that, because it's not a legal ban on third parties. It's about how voters behave in the polling booth, right? The fear of the wasted vote.
Precisely. Let's imagine you are a voter who deeply cares about environmentalism. You align perfectly with the Green Party.
Okay.
But you are voting in a winner-take-all district.
Yeah.
You look at the polling and you realize the Green Party candidate is only going to get 10% of the vote. If you vote for them, they get zero power, and your vote essentially vanishes.
But it's worse than that. By not voting for the major party candidate who somewhat agrees with you, let's say the Democrat, you are accidentally helping the major party candidate you deeply despise, the Republican, win the seat.
Yes. The math bullies the voter. It forces them to abandon their true ideological preference and hold their nose to vote for the lesser of two evils.
And over time.
Over multiple election cycles, the voters learn this lesson. Donors stop giving money to third parties because it's a bad investment. Media stops covering them. The entire ecosystem starves the third parties of oxygen until only two massive coalition-style parties remain competitive.
I want to test this theory on a global scale, because India provides a fascinating counterexample, or at least it seems to.
India.
India's lower house of parliament, the Lok Sabha, is massive. And following the 2019 elections, there were 37 different political parties that won seats. That completely shatters Duverger's law, doesn't it?
It appears to until you zoom in. India is a vast, incredibly diverse continent of a country. Nationally, there are dozens of parties. But Duverger's law applies to the district level. When researchers look at India state by state, the law holds perfectly.
Really?
Yes. In the state of Gujarat, the local politics are entirely dominated by a brutal binary contest between the BJP and the Indian National Congress. Between the two of them, they consumed over 95% of the vote.
But if you go to a different state, the two dominant giants change.
Exactly. If you travel south to the state of Andhra Pradesh, the national giants are almost irrelevant. The two dominant parties locked in a death match there are the Telugu Desam Party and the YSR Congress Party. They take 90% of the vote.
Wow.
So while the national picture looks like a kaleidoscope of diversity, the localized winner-take-all mechanics force every individual voter into a binary choice.
Okay, so we've mapped out all the ways citizens vote people into the engine room. But the research points out a glaring exception to all of this. Not everyone in a legislature is elected by the public. Some of the most powerful legislative seats in the world are filled via appointments.
Yes, they are.
We discussed authoritarian regimes earlier, but let's look at the actual plumbing of how they fill the room. The National People's Congress in China is the largest parliamentary body in the world, but the average citizen does not vote for those delegates directly. It is a system of nested dolls.
It's a layered, indirect system designed to ensure loyalty. Citizens at the very bottom vote for local village or county assemblies. Those local assemblies then vote to select the members of the provincial assemblies. And finally, those provincial assemblies vote to select the delegates who travel to Beijing for the National Congress.
By the time you get to the top level, any direct accountability to the average voter on the street has been completely laundered out of the system.
Exactly. The delegates are accountable to the party machinery that promoted them through the ranks, not to the public. And we see direct appointments play a massive role in monarchies as well.
Like where?
Look at Bahrain. They have a split legislature. The lower chamber is elected by the people, but the upper chamber, the Consultative Council, consists of 40 seats, and every single one of them is appointed directly by the king.
Wait, the king just picks all 40?
Yes.
So the people can originate legislation in the lower house, but it has to pass the upper house, which is just 40 guys handpicked by the monarch. It's an ultimate kill switch for the king.
It is a hard structural check on democratic momentum. But appointments aren't just for autocracies and kings. Look at the Bahamas, which is a robust parliamentary democracy. Their Senate, the upper chamber, has 16 members, and not one of them is directly elected. They are all appointed by the Governor General.
But there's a democratic tether there, right? Because the Governor General isn't just picking names out of a hat.
Right. The appointments are heavily influenced by the elected leaders. The Prime Minister effectively chooses 9 of the members, the Leader of the Opposition chooses 4, and the final 3 are chosen after consultation. Because the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader have to face the voters in general elections, there is an indirect chain of accountability. But the senators themselves never face a ballot box.
Even in the U.S., we have a remnant of this. If a U.S. senator tragically dies or resigns midterm, the governor of their home state usually has the unilateral power to appoint a temporary replacement who holds full voting power until the next special election. So the doors to the engine room aren't just guarded by ballot boxes.
No, they are not.
Which leads us to a massive structural question about the physical space itself. We've mentioned lower chambers and upper chambers. How does splitting the legislature into 2 physical rooms alter the laws they produce? The research contrasts unicameral systems, 1 single room, with bicameral systems, 2 separate rooms. Let's look at the unicameral setup first.
Okay.
If you only have 1 chamber, the process is streamlined for speed. A bill is proposed, it goes through committee, it hits the floor, the majority votes for it, and boom, it is essentially law.
Unicameral systems are incredibly efficient. You find them frequently in smaller, more homogeneous nations, many island nations, parts of the Middle East and Africa, and Scandinavian countries like Sweden. When society generally agrees on the direction of the country, you don't need a complex labyrinth to navigate.
But the danger of speed is impulsivity. The research points out a glaring weakness of a single room, the lack of a natural veto point.
Yes. If a unicameral legislature, especially one dominated by a strong prime minister, decides on a whim to pass a highly controversial, sweeping, and perhaps poorly drafted law on a Tuesday, it can become the law of the land by Wednesday.
Just like that.
Just like that. There is no second chamber to act as a structural break. There is no forced pause to allow the public to react or to demand that experts review the text for errors. Efficiency can easily tip into tyranny of the majority.
Which is precisely why roughly half the countries on Earth, including the U.S., operate a bicameral system. 2 separate rooms. And they are just carbon copies of each other. They usually represent entirely different cross-sections of society.
Right.
The lower chamber typically represents the people directly, apportioned by population. But the upper chamber often represents territories, states, or specific classes. The research uses the German Bundesrat as a brilliant example of this.
It's a Bundesrat.
The Bundesrat is the upper chamber, and it represents the 16 German states, the Länder. But it doesn't operate like the U.S. Senate, where every senator votes their own conscience.
No, it operates on the principle of collective state interest. Each of the 16 German states is allocated between 3 and 6 votes in the Bundesrat, depending on their population. But the crucial rule is that a state's delegation must cast all of its votes as a single unified block.
Wait, so if Bavaria gets 6 votes, they can't vote 4 in favor and 2 against?
No, they have to slam all 6 votes down on the table for one side.
Wow.
It forces the state government back home to reach an internal consensus on how they want their delegation to vote. This structural rule ensures that the federal government in Berlin cannot pass major legislation without explicitly securing the unified buy-in of the regional state governments.
It's an incredible mechanism for forcing consensus, but I want to use an analogy here for bicameralism in general, because having 2 chambers that both have to agree sounds exactly like the 2-key system in a nuclear missile silo.
That's a vivid image.
You have 2 officers sitting on opposite ends of a bunker, and they both have to turn their keys at the exact same millisecond to launch the missile.
Yeah.
It is intentionally designed to be difficult, to prevent one rogue officer from making an impulsive, catastrophic decision. But doesn't this 2-key system just guarantee that the machine will eventually freeze up? If you make it that hard to pass a law, doesn't it paralyze the government?
You have identified the tragic paradox of bicameralism. The exact structural friction designed to protect the system from impulsive mistakes is the same friction that prevents the system from solving urgent existential problems. The research points to the American attempt at comprehensive immigration reform as the ultimate case study of this failure.
It's a painful example. Between 2000 and 2020, there was a broad national consensus across multiple presidencies that the U.S. immigration system was fundamentally broken and required an overhaul. But they could never get it done.
Because of the 2 keys. In the U.S., the House and the Senate must pass the exact same text of a bill. Not similar text, identical text. And they operate on a strict, ticking 2-year clock called a congressional session. If the House passes a massive immigration reform bill in year 1, but the Senate spends 18 months arguing over amendments, and the 2-year clock expires.
The bill dies.
Exactly. The bill dies, the entire process resets to 0.
You have to start all over again with a totally new Congress.
Exactly. Over those 2 decades, we saw different versions of immigration reform pass the House. We saw different versions pass the Senate. But because of the differing political incentives in each chamber, they could almost never align to turn the 2 keys at the exact same moment before the clock ran out.
Wow.
The bicameral structure, designed to enforce broad consensus, instead ensured 2 decades of total paralysis on a critical national issue.
That is a staggering realization.
Right.
The rules built to protect us are actively preventing us from adapting. And this sets the stage perfectly for the final phase of our deep dive. Oversight and the threat of decline. We've focused intensely on the legislature's role in making laws. But their other massive, equally important responsibility is babysitting the executive branch. This is the concept of oversight. The executive branch has the standing military, they have the police forces, they have the massive bureaucratic agencies that enforce the rules. The legislature doesn't have an army. They only have the rule book and the checkbook.
But the checkbook is the ultimate weapon. Legislatures exercise oversight primarily through the appropriations process, the power of the purse. The executive branch cannot spend a single dime that the legislature hasn't explicitly authorized.
Right.
If a government agency is executing the laws well and pleasing the legislature, they are rewarded with a massive budget increase. If an agency goes rogue, ignores legislative intent, or becomes mired in scandal, the legislature can ruthlessly slash their funding. It is the ultimate carrot and stick.
But to know where to swing the stick, you need information. And that's where aggressive public hearings come into play. The research highlights the UK Parliament's Health and Social Care Select Committee. This committee is tasked with overseeing the National Health Service, the NHS, which is a massive, incredibly complex bureaucracy.
And they don't just quietly read reports. They hold highly adversarial public inquiries. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, this committee hauled senior NHS officials and government ministers into the room to aggressively grill them on the delivery of core services, PPE shortages, and the safety of maternity wards.
So they put them on the spot.
Exactly. These hearings are designed to force the executive branch out of the shadows, making them publicly justify their failures on the record.
I find the UK system fascinating because they have a mechanism that goes even further than committee hearings. Parliamentary questions. Specifically Prime Minister's questions, or PMQs. If you've never seen this, it is spectacular political theater.
It is the most intense accountability mechanism in modern democracy. Every single week, the Prime Minister must walk into the House of Commons, stand at the dispatch box, and face a barrage of direct, often hostile questions from the Leader of the Opposition and regular backbench members.
It looks like a civilized shouting match. The Prime Minister is standing there while hundreds of opposing politicians jeer and demand answers for every mistake the government made that week. Imagine if your boss forced you to do a weekly performance review on live national television while your coworkers booed you.
It's a brutal gauntlet. And Germany utilizes a similar, though perhaps slightly more orderly, system. In the Bundestag, following the weekly cabinet meeting, government ministers are required to stand before the legislature for 35 minutes to answer spontaneous, unscripted questions, followed by a grueling 2-hour session of answering detailed written questions submitted by lawmakers in advance.
And the research makes a profound point about why this specific mechanism, the question period, is so vital. It's about the power of the minority.
Exactly. To hold a formal committee hearing, you usually need the permission of the majority party because they chair the committees. A majority party will naturally want to protect their prime minister from embarrassing hearings.
Makes sense.
But parliamentary questions bypass that block. Any individual member of parliament from the smallest fringe minority party has the right to stand up and submit a question. They can shine a glaring spotlight on an issue that the majority is desperately trying to hide, and they don't need anyone's permission to do it.
It is the ultimate defense mechanism against executive overreach. But despite having the power of the purse, and despite having these public interrogation tools, the research ends on a distinctly dark and ominous note.
It does.
It outlines 3 existential threats facing legislatures in the 21st century. 3 structural reasons why the engine room of democracy is slowly but surely surrendering its power. The first threat is executive dominance. This is the global trend of presidents and prime ministers aggressively expanding their authority while the system slowly normalizes the overreach. It can happen in a rapid authoritarian power grab during a crisis, or it can happen through 1,000 tiny incremental loopholes. But the endpoint is the same. The executive swallows the policy-making authority, and the legislature fails to claw it back. Now, the research provides specific case studies of this from wildly different political systems, and I want to present these strictly as the objective political science data lays them out.
It is a phenomenon that crosses all ideological boundaries. In the United States, political scientists track a distinct rise in the use of executive action, executive orders, presidential memorandums by presidents of both parties as a direct response to legislative gridlock.
So when they can't get it done in Congress.
Right. The research highlights President Obama utilizing executive action to create the DACA program for childhood arrivals, bypassing Congress when they repeatedly failed to pass comprehensive immigration reform. Similarly, the research points to President Trump declaring a national emergency to reallocate military funds to build a border wall, an action taken specifically because Congress had explicitly refused to appropriate the funding he requested.
In both of those American examples, the executive decided the problem was too urgent to wait for the legislature, so they simply bypassed the engine room entirely to achieve a policy goal.
And when you look outside democratic systems, the mechanism of executive dominance is much more aggressive. The research points to Russia in 2020. President Vladimir Putin orchestrated sweeping constitutional changes.
Right.
These changes were explicitly designed to reset his term limits, potentially allowing him to remain in power for his lifetime. But crucially, these constitutional changes also structurally weakened the Russian legislature, the Federal Assembly, reducing their oversight capabilities and formally concentrating even more absolute authority in the hands of the executive.
So threat number one is the executive forcefully taking power. But threat number two is perhaps even more depressing because it comes from inside the House. Legislative deference. This is the phenomenon where lawmakers are actively, voluntarily giving their power away to the executive. Why on earth would a powerful politician willingly surrender their authority?
Because exercising power requires making choices, and choices anger voters. Lawmakers today face a hyper-scrutinized environment where any vote on a controversial, complex issue is going to enrage at least half of their constituency. So the ultimate survival tactic is deference. They refuse to legislate.
So they essentially play dead to avoid taking damage.
Yes. They pass incredibly vague, hollow laws that just say, we agree pollution is bad, and then they legally defer all the actual painful rulemaking authority to the bureaucratic agencies in the executive branch. Or they simply act as rubber stamps, blindly approving whatever the president or prime minister demands.
Wow.
By deferring, the individual politician avoids leaving fingerprints on controversial policies. If the policy is a disaster, the lawmaker can go on cable news, act outraged, and blame the bureaucrats. They are trading the institutional power of the legislature for their own personal job security.
They're abandoning their post in the engine room because they don't want to get their hands dirty. And that leads us to the third, final threat, which acts as the toxic fuel for the first two. Polarization. This is the sociological fracturing of the public and the politicians into extreme, uncompromising, hostile camps.
Polarization destroys the necessary friction of a legislature. The research notes that in the U.S. Congress, the rates of bipartisan cooperation, members crossing the aisle to co-sponsor or vote for a rival party's bill, have been plummeting steadily since the 1980s. Voting has become strictly tribal. And in Europe, the 2019 parliamentary elections saw a massive surge in both far-right and far-left populist parties gaining seats.
And when a legislature fills up with factions who view compromise not as a necessary tool, but as literal treason against their base, the entire machine locks up.
It creates a doom loop. Polarization causes total gridlock. The legislature stops solving problems. The public gets furious that nothing is happening. To satisfy the angry public, the executive steps in and asserts dominance, bypassing the legislature to take action. And the polarized legislature, terrified of their primary voters, gladly defers to the executive to avoid blame. It is a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle of institutional decline. The veto points designed to protect deliberation have been weaponized for pure obstruction. The engine room stops producing solutions. It just produces heat.
It is a fragile ecosystem. We've covered a massive amount of ground today on how this ecosystem operates. We define the legislature as the factory where societal demands are forged into public laws. We walk through the grueling mechanics of sponsorship, the strategic theater, committee hearings, and the profound differences between a simple majority and a supermajority threshold.
You did.
We explored the tension of representation, how geographic districts breed local champions while national lists empower party bosses. We looked at the math of descriptive representation, proving that who is in the room changes what gets discussed. We debated the eternal struggle of Edmund Burke's delegate versus trustee models.
Right.
We mapped the macro power dynamics, contrasting the engineered gridlock of presidential systems with the precarious efficiency of parliamentary systems. We broke down Duverger's law, explaining the psychological math that forces American voters into a two-party binary. We examined the speed of unicameral rooms versus the deliberate, often paralyzing friction of bicameral systems. And finally, we looked at the existential threats, the slow surrender of power through executive dominance, legislative deference, and the toxic paralysis of polarization.
And as we pull all of these threads together, looking at the immense complexity of what we demand these human beings to process, I want to pose a final provocative scenario for you to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
We discussed how lawmakers rely heavily on legislative delegation, trusting committees and party experts because they are drowning in information overload. But the complexity of the world is accelerating exponentially. We are nearing a point where issues like advanced climate geoengineering, the algorithmic regulation of global markets, or the biochemistry of synthetic pathogens are simply beyond the comprehension of a human legislator who spends half their day raising campaign funds.
The human brain just can't process the data required to write a flawless law on those topics.
Exactly. So what happens in the very near future when we inevitably introduce artificial intelligence into the engine room? When we task an advanced AI with reading the data, predicting the economic outcomes, and drafting the optimal legislation?
Are you suggesting the AI becomes the ultimate trustee?
That is the inevitable question. If an AI can analyze a billion data points and objectively determine the best policy for long-term survival, what role does the human politician play? Do they just become a biological rubber stamp, deferring to the algorithm because they can't mathematically argue with it?
That is terrifying, because if the lawmaker defers to the AI, who is actually writing the code that governs society? Who is making the laws for you?
It is the ultimate evolution of legislative deference, and it's a reality we're going to have to face much sooner than we think.
That is a chilling place to end, but it proves exactly why understanding this machine is so vital. The engine room is running, the gears are turning, and the rules of the room dictate the reality of your life. The more you understand how the levers work, the better equipped you are to demand accountability from the people pulling them. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the machine, keep asking the big questions, and we will see you next time. Have you ever found yourself just flipping through the channels late at night?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Or maybe, scrolling mindlessly online, and you suddenly land on a live broadcast of your national legislature.
Right.
You know the exact visual I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe it's C-SPAN in the U.S. or BBC Parliament or whatever the equivalent public access channel is wherever you happen to live.
Yeah, that wide-angle shot of the room.
Exactly. You look at the screen and you see this grand, just majestic room. Ornate woodwork, plush carpets. I mean, history is practically dripping off the walls.
It's very dramatic.
But the room is completely, utterly empty.
Just a ghost town.
Right. There's like one lone person standing at a mahogany podium, and they're speaking incredibly passionately, waving their arms, pounding their fist into their palm. And there is literally no one sitting in the hundreds of chairs listening to them.
It really is a striking, almost haunting visual when you think about it.
Have you ever actually stopped to wonder why that is? Or, for that matter, why public approval ratings for these legislative bodies, I mean, the very institutions designed from the ground up to represent our voices, are consistently hovering somewhere in the single digits?
It's a great question. Because that cavernous, empty chamber, it perfectly captures this ambient sense of institutional crisis that a lot of citizens, they feel it intuitively.
Yeah, true.
But they often can't quite put it into words. It just feels like a machine running on idle.
Well, today, we are going to crack open the architectural blueprints of modern democracy. We need to figure out why the systems designed to protect our voices seem to be, well, increasingly ignoring them.
We really do.
So we're doing a deep dive into a stack of political science research today. We're specifically pulling from some incredibly detailed textbook excerpts that examine the entire life cycle of the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary.
And there's so much to unpack there.
Oh, a ton. We're going to map out how these bodies were originally designed to function centuries ago, how they actually operate today behind closed committee doors, and ultimately why there is a massive, undeniable global trend of power slipping away from parliaments and flowing directly toward chief executives.
Which is absolutely crucial because to understand the dysfunction of modern government, we can't just look at today's headlines.
Right. You can't just blame the current batch of politicians.
Exactly. We really have to look at the foundations. Because the structural flaws we see today are, in many ways, features that were baked into the system from the very beginning.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to diagnose why legislatures are currently struggling so badly, we need to establish why we even have them in the first place.
Yeah, it's a fundamental question.
I mean, this idea of a room full of people debating laws didn't just fall out of the sky. Where does this evolutionary tree of power actually begin?
It begins with the simple reality that political institutions, they have to become more specialized and more complex as the societies they govern modernize.
It makes sense.
If you rewind the clock all the way back to primitive clans, human organization is relatively simple. You mostly see a single leader governing.
Just one person calling the shots.
Right. It's direct, it's efficient, and, when the group is small enough, one person can reasonably mediate disputes and make survival decisions.
But I'm guessing that breaks down when the group gets bigger.
Exactly that. As those clans merge into larger tribes, the complexity of managing the group scales up dramatically. That's when you start to see the addition of councils.
Because one person physically cannot hold all the context anymore.
Yeah, the chief or the singular leader suddenly faces major problems. Resource allocation, warfare, complex internal disputes. It's simply too massive for one brain to process.
Right.
So they bring in elders or notable warriors to debate. From there, you fast forward to the development of city-states.
Like ancient Athens.
Exactly. Look at Athens. They developed assemblies that were essentially massive open-air gatherings of citizens. They combined legislative, executive, and judicial functions all into one giant, often chaotic, deliberative body.
Then you get to the Roman Senate, which is probably, the historical body most people are at least casually familiar with.
Oh, for sure.
But the textbook points out something fascinating about Rome. The Senate's power wasn't static. It actually maps perfectly onto the decline of the Republic.
It really does. The Roman Senate is a masterclass in how legislatures can be hollowed out from the inside.
Wow, how so?
Well, during the era of the Roman Republic, the Senate was the absolute powerhouse. It controlled the finances, it directed foreign policy, it managed the provinces.
They were running the show.
Exactly. But as Rome transitioned into an empire, the Senate didn't just disappear overnight.
Right, they kept the building, they kept the robes.
Yeah. It was kept around as a symbol, but its actual functional powers steadily declined. It basically became a rubber stamp. All the real decision-making power concentrated back into the hands of a single executive, the emperor.
A trend we are definitely going to see repeating itself in the modern era.
Oh, spoiler alert, yes.
But out of the ashes of Rome, we get to the Middle Ages and the rise of feudalism. And this is where the textbook argues we get our first real structural glimpse of the modern balance of power.
Yeah, feudalism gets a bad rap. It's just a dark age of, peasants and warlords. But politically, it was essentially a highly delicate, heavily armed balancing act.
Heavily armed being the key phrase there.
Right. Power was distributed among a monarch, the landed nobles, and the leading churchmen. And this leads to a critical, sweeping historical insight. If you look at a map of the world today, countries that have a deeply ingrained culture of limited government almost always have feudal pasts.
Wait, really? So what is the connective tissue there? Why does a history of knights and castles translate to modern democracy?
Because the core operational mechanic of feudalism teaches a society over centuries that the dispersion of power is necessary, and the absolute concentration of power is dangerous.
Okay, I see.
Under feudalism, the king wasn't all-powerful. He relied on the nobles to provide knights and armies.
Right, he needed their resources.
Exactly. If the king overstepped, the nobles could, and often did, rebel. They constantly kept the monarch in check.
That makes total sense.
The textbook contrasts this with countries that have long absolutist traditions. It uses China as a primary example. Societies with a history of unbroken, absolute, centralized authority have historically struggled to found and maintain democracies.
Because they just lack that ingrained cultural muscle memory of power sharing.
Precisely. They never had that decentralized balancing act.
There's this incredible historical anecdote in the text that perfectly illustrates this feudal mindset. It's an oath that the nobles of medieval Aragon, which is a region in northeast Spain, they used this to pledge to a new king.
Oh, the Aragon Oath. It's so good.
It really is. They would stand before the monarch and say, and I'm quoting here, "We, who are as good as you, swear to you, who are no better than we, to accept you as our king and sovereign lord, provided you observe all our statutes and laws. And if not, no."
And if not, no. I mean, it is arguably one of the most brilliant sentences in political history.
Oh, so blunt.
It is. What you are witnessing there is a conditional surrender of power. The nobles aren't submitting to some divine right, They are establishing a transactional social contract right there in the Middle Ages.
It honestly makes me think of a modern Kickstarter campaign.
Okay, a Kickstarter. I like this. Go on.
Seriously, follow me on this. You have these ambitious, war-hungry monarchs all over Europe, right? They're essentially desperate creators who want to launch a massive, highly expensive project, usually a war against their neighbor.
Right, wars are not cheap.
Exactly, but they don't have the funding. The royal treasury is totally empty. So they call an assembly of notables. These wealthy nobles are the Kickstarter backers.
I love this analogy.
Right? The monarch stands in front of them and says, "Look, I need your money to fund my campaign." And the backers look at the pitch and say, "Sure, we'll fund you. But in exchange for this financial backing, this power of the purse, we demand a stretch goal.
They want perks.
Exactly. They say, we demand a modest input into your policies. We want creative control over how this project is run.
That is so accurate because it gets to the absolute root of legislative authority: leverage. The monarchs didn't invite the nobles to Parliament because they valued their opinions.
They just wanted the cash.
They invited them because they desperately needed tax revenues to survive. In Britain, you had the early Parliament, which was originally divided into two houses: the Lords for peers and high church leaders, and the Commons for knights and wealthy local burghers.
And other countries had similar setups, right?
Yeah, in Sweden, you had the Riksdag, that originally had four chambers representing the estates: nobles, clerics, burghers, and farmers. But in every single case, the transaction was exactly the same.
Show me the money.
Right. In exchange for granting the monarch the legal authority to extract taxes from their lands, these assemblies demanded a say in how the country was run.
But that Kickstarter campaign didn't succeed everywhere. The textbook highlights the French Estates General as a catastrophic failure of this model.
It was a huge failure. The French Estates General also had three houses, representing the nobles, the clerics, and the commoners. But it was structurally weak from the start.
Why was it so weak?
Well, the French monarchs were incredibly adept at dividing and conquering those three groups. As a result, the Estates General was eventually sidelined and forgotten entirely. French monarchs gathered more and more personal, centralized power.
And so you get to, like, Louis XIV.
Exactly, the absolute monarchy. They bypassed the legislature entirely. But in Britain and Sweden, those assemblies stubbornly held their ground. They slowly grew in power.
They didn't let the monarch divide them.
No. And by the 16th century in Britain, King Henry VIII actually found himself deeply reliant on Parliament. He wanted to break England away from the Roman Catholic Church, which was a massively controversial move.
Oh, yeah, huge deal.
And he needed the legal and political cover that only a vote from Parliament could provide.
He needed the board of directors to sign off on a massive corporate pivot.
Precisely. And that reliance only made Parliament stronger. By the 17th century, they viewed themselves as totally co-equal with the monarch, especially when it came to levying taxes.
The power of the purse again.
Always. The tension got so high that the English Civil War broke out, which was fundamentally a bloody quarrel over who possessed top authority.
And Parliament won that one.
Decisively. In 1649, Parliament definitively settled the debate by trying, convicting, and beheading King Charles I.
Which is the ultimate hostile takeover.
Yeah, you could definitely call it that.
But for you listening, I want to pause for a second and connect this historical power of the purse to your life right now. Because the taxes extracted from your paycheck are still the ultimate leverage in modern politics.
They really are.
The entire philosophical foundation of representative government was built on the idea that if the state wants your money to fund its projects, it is legally and morally obligated to listen to your voice.
And this historical fork in the road where France plunged into absolutism and Britain fought its way toward parliamentary supremacy, it eventually resulted in two completely distinct, wildly different operating systems for modern democracies.
Right, and this accidental historical evolution brings us to the great system divide, fusion of power versus separation of power.
It's the core split in democratic theory.
Let's tackle the parliamentary system first, which the textbook refers to as a strict fusion of power. How does the machinery actually work?
Well, in a parliamentary system, which is the model you see in Britain, Germany, and Japan, and honestly the vast majority of the democratic world, the voters essentially only have one job on election day.
Just one.
Yep. They walk into the voting booth and elect a legislature. That's it. They do not vote directly for a chief executive, like a president.
So the people build the legislature, but where does the leader of the country come from?
The leader grows organically out of the legislature itself. Once the parliament is seated, the members vote to elect an executive from among their own ranks.
Okay, so it's internal.
Exactly. The leader of the political party that wins the most seats, or, the leader of a coalition of parties that holds a majority, becomes the prime minister.
Got it.
The prime minister then selects their cabinet. So the ministers of defense, finance, health, what Americans would call the administration, and they choose these ministers almost exclusively from the existing members of parliament.
So the executive branch isn't a separate entity at all. It is literally an offshoot, like a committee of the legislative branch. They are completely fused together.
Hence the term fusion of power.
And the most critical mechanic of this system is accountability. Right? The prime minister doesn't get a guaranteed 4-year term, do they?
No, they
That,
absolutely do not. The prime minister and their cabinet serve only as long as they maintain the confidence of the parliament.
right.
If the parliament gets unhappy with how the country is being run, or if the prime minister introduces a deeply unpopular budget, the legislature can trigger a vote of no confidence.
And if they lose that vote.
If the prime minister loses that vote, they're immediately fired. The government collapses on the spot, and either a new government is formed from the existing parliament or new national elections are called right then and there.
It's so fast. Now contrast that with the presidential system. And the textbook is quick to point out that this is actually a minority approach globally, largely concentrated in North and South America. This is the system defined by the separation of power.
Right. In a presidential system like the United States, the architecture is entirely different. The president is elected independently of the legislature.
They have their own mandate from the voters.
Exactly. They occupy a completely separate branch of government. The president combines the ceremonial role of head of state with the functional role of chief of government. They possess considerable constitutional powers, they command the military, and crucially, they cannot be ousted by the legislature over a mere policy disagreement.
Right. They don't owe their existence to the legislature, and the legislature doesn't owe its existence to them.
Yeah.
They're two totally separate power centers.
Completely independent.
But this begs a massive question. If the vast majority of the world looked at the British parliamentary system and thought, yes, that makes sense, let's copy that, how did the United States end up inventing this totally different, deeply complicated system of separated powers?
It is such a fascinating story.
The textbook has this explanation, and it all traces back to a French philosopher named Montesquieu.
Ah, yes, the Baron de Montesquieu. He is one of the towering figures of the Enlightenment. In the middle of the 18th century, Montesquieu traveled around Europe studying different governments, and he wrote a massively influential, sweeping book called The Spirit of the Laws.
Okay.
During his travels, he had spent time in England and was deeply impressed by their liberties and their legal system, especially compared to the absolute monarchy in his native France.
Sure, France was pretty locked down at that point.
Right. So he theorized that English liberty was the direct result of a mutual structural balancing act between the king, who acted as the executive, and parliament, which acted as the legislative branch. He wrote that these separate forces checked and balanced each other, preventing tyranny.
I mean, it sounds perfectly logical.
It does.
But the textbook points out what it bluntly calls the great misunderstanding. Montesquieu got the facts completely wrong.
He did. He really did. He was an incredible philosopher, but a slightly flawed political reporter.
How did he mess it up?
What Montesquieu was describing in his book was an idealized, highly romanticized, and severely outdated version of an English mixed monarchy.
Oh, so he was looking at the past.
Yes. By the time he was actually writing The Spirit of the Laws, the English Parliament was already completely supreme over the king. The executive and legislative branches weren't locked in an equal balancing act anymore.
Parliament was already running the show.
Firmly running the show. The monarch was already transitioning into a more ceremonial role.
So wait, just to make sure I am wrapping my head around this. Are you saying the United States Founding Fathers designed their entire complex governmental structure of checks and balances based on a French tourist's fundamental misunderstanding of how British politics actually work?
It is one of the great ironies of history, but essentially, yeah, yes.
That's wild.
The American founders were deeply well-read, and they took Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws as gospel. Furthermore, they had just fought a brutal revolutionary war against King George III.
Whom they viewed as an executive dictator.
Exactly. They were terrified of concentrated executive power. So when they read Montesquieu's theory about separating the branches to check and balance each other, they thought it was the perfect blueprint.
Let's do that.
Right. So they built a system with rigid separation of powers that is so incredibly complex that very few other countries in the world have ever successfully adopted it without eventually sliding into authoritarianism.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, the textbook notes that Western European political scientists often look at the American system and find it utterly unintelligible. They see it as structurally paralyzed.
Well, to really visualize how different these two philosophies are, the textbook describes the physical layout of the British House of Commons. because architecture dictates behavior, right?
Right.
And the British Parliament is the ultimate physical manifestation of that fusion of power.
It really is. Picture the room. It's not a semicircle of desks facing a podium like in the U.S. Congress.
That's very different.
It is a rectangular room, and the members of the two main parties sit on long benches directly facing each other across a narrow center aisle.
And the physical proximity is intense. The government benches are on one side of the aisle, holding the party in power.
Right.
The opposition benches are on the exact opposite side.
And that aisle dividing them, it's famously said to be exactly 2 sword lengths wide, which is a historical remnant to prevent members from literally stabbing each other during debates.
Which is just incredible. And on the very front bench of the government side, right in the thick of it, sits the Prime Minister and their cabinet ministers.
Yes.
Directly across from them, mere feet away on the front bench of the opposition side, sits what they call the shadow cabinet.
Right. These are the opposition leaders who are assigned to critique specific ministers.
Right.
And they would take over those exact executive roles if their party won a snap election tomorrow.
And then radiating up and behind both of these front benches sit the backbenchers, which are the hundreds of ordinary members of Parliament who don't hold executive responsibilities.
It creates a highly confrontational, intensely theatrical, but deeply integrated environment.
Because they're all right there.
Exactly. The executive isn't hiding in a different building down the street like the White House. During question hour, the Prime Minister and the cabinet ministers have to physically stand at the dispatch box, face to face with their fiercest opponents, and answer rapid-fire, unscripted questions about their policies.
That is a level of direct, daily accountability that simply does not exist in a presidential system. I mean, the U.S. president cannot be summoned to the floor of the Senate to be publicly grilled by the opposing party.
No, absolutely not.
But because these two systems are wired so fundamentally differently, they each suffer from a unique, almost fatal structural flaw when it comes to the basic task of getting things done. We can't have a perfect system, right? We have to choose our poison.
Always a trade-off.
Which brings us to the great dilemma: presidential deadlock versus parliamentary immobilism.
Every democratic system struggles with the friction between the desire to pass laws and the reality of executing them. In the U.S. presidential system, the textbook quotes the brilliant political scientist Edward S. Corwin. He famously described the American separation of powers as an invitation to struggle.
An invitation to struggle. That's a great phrase.
It's perfect. Because the executive branch and the legislative branch are entirely separate, they derive their power from different election cycles.
Right.
And they're frequently controlled by completely different hostile political parties, so they structurally stymie each other.
Which is the polite political science term for gridlock.
Exactly.
Okay.
The system is designed to jam. The president cannot dissolve Congress and call for new elections just because they are refusing to pass his budget.
Nope.
And conversely, Congress cannot oust the president simply because they think his economic policy is ruinous. Short of impeachment, which requires a massive, almost impossible supermajority consensus, they are stuck with each other.
Right. And the textbook uses a few structural historical examples to illustrate this. It points to the intense deadlock between the Obama administration and a Republican-dominated Congress, where immense amounts of domestic policy simply ground to a halt.
Yes.
It also points to the rare pressure release valves of impeachment, citing the proceedings against Bill Clinton, Andrew Johnson, and the impending impeachment that forced Richard Nixon's resignation.
And it's worth noting here the textbook brings up these specific presidencies, whether Democrat or Republican, not to litigate the politics of those eras.
Right, exactly. We are neutrally reporting the textbook's historical examples here. This is purely a fascinating structural example of how a presidential system experiences massive internal friction when the branches go to war with each other.
It is purely a mechanical analysis. The machinery of a presidential system fundamentally trades policy efficiency for executive stability.
So the president is going to stay in power for their guaranteed 4-year term. The ship of state won't suddenly lose its captain. But it becomes agonizingly difficult to actually turn the steering wheel and pass sweeping laws.
Precisely. Now, switch gears back to the parliamentary system. They do not suffer from gridlock.
Because the executive is the majority in the legislature.
Exactly. By definition, they have the votes. If the prime minister wants a law passed, the parliament votes for it, and it happens. It's incredibly fast.
But their Achilles heel is something the text calls immobilism. How does a system that is designed to move so fast suddenly freeze up?
Immobilism plagues multi-party parliamentary systems, especially where the electoral math results in no single party winning an outright majority of the seats.
Which happens a lot in Europe.
Very often. So in order to form a government and get a prime minister seated, the largest party has to walk across the aisle and partner with several smaller, often ideologically diverse, fringe parties. They have to cobble together a coalition that crosses that 50% threshold.
And what is the mechanical danger of that?
The danger is that coalition partners inevitably quarrel. Let's say you have a center-left prime minister who needs the votes of a small, hardline environmental party to keep their majority.
Okay, I can see where this is going.
If the prime minister proposes a new highway project, that small environmental party might say, cancel the highway or we withdraw our support.
And if they walk away?
The coalition's math drops to 49%. The majority is gone. The prime minister instantly loses a vote of no confidence, and the entire national government collapses over a single highway bill.
Wow. And the textbook cites Italy as the extreme poster child for this, noting they have had something like 60 different governments since World War II.
Which sounds like absolute apocalyptic chaos to someone living in a presidential system.
It sounds exhausting.
It does. But practically, it usually just means the cabinet fell apart, the prime minister resigned, and the exact same political parties have to spend 3 weeks locked in a room horse trading to put a slightly reshuffled cabinet back together.
Okay, so the country doesn't actually burn down.
No, the bureaucracy keeps running. However, the real insidious problem is that prime ministers in these multi-party coalitions become paralyzed by fear.
Right.
They are so terrified of offending a minor coalition partner and collapsing the entire government that they simply refuse to launch any new, necessary, but controversial policies. The status quo becomes permanent. That is immobilism.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We tend to look at Britain as this pristine bastion of stable, two-party parliamentary democracy. But the textbook points out that even Britain's legendary stability completely evaporates the moment the math fails them, and they are forced to form minority governments.
Because the entire British apparatus is built on the assumption that one single party will win a clear majority.
Right.
When the electorate fractures and returns a hung parliament, as happened famously in the 1970s with a struggling minority Labour government, they have to rely on informal agreements with small regional parties just to survive day to day.
And when those small parties inevitably pull their support,
the government falls. It proves that the stability of any parliamentary system doesn't come from the rules of the parliament itself. It relies entirely on the strength and discipline of the party system operating beneath it.
So for you listening, it raises a genuinely profound question about how you prefer to be governed. If you had to choose the lesser of two structural evils, which would you pick?
It's a tough choice.
Right. A parliamentary system that can move incredibly fast and respond to crises instantly, but might suffer from unstable, collapsing executives and immobilism? Or the American presidential system, which is so deeply slow, gridlocked, and frustrating that it takes years to get anything done, but which successfully prevents foolish reactionary policies from passing quickly.
It is the ultimate architectural trade-off in democratic design. And, to really understand where the actual day-to-day work happens amidst all this high-level gridlock or immobilism, we have to zoom in. We have to look closer at the physical anatomy of the legislative bodies themselves.
Let's look at the chambers. Bicameral versus unicameral. So 2 chambers versus 1. The textbook notes that roughly 2/3 of the world's parliaments are bicameral, meaning they have a lower house and an upper house. Why is 2 the magic number for so many countries?
Well, the necessity of 2 chambers largely depends on whether a country is federal or unitary.
Okay, break that down.
In federal systems like the United States, Germany, or Australia, a bicameral legislature is an absolute structural requirement. A federal system, by definition, divides sovereign power between a national government and regional governments, like states or provinces.
So the legislature needs a mathematical way to represent both the sheer math of the population and the geographic regions themselves.
Precisely. The lower house represents the people directly based on population density. The U.S. House of Representatives or the German Bundestag, they are apportioned so that areas with more people have more power.
But if that were the only chamber, large states would tyrannize small states.
Exactly. So the upper house represents the component parts equally, regardless of population. The U.S. Senate gives 2 seats to Wyoming and 2 seats to California. The German Bundesrat represents the individual Länder, or states. It is the great compromise that allows federalism to exist.
Okay, that makes total sense for a federal system. But what about unitary systems? These are countries where all the sovereign power is concentrated squarely in the national government and the capital, and it isn't permanently shared with regional states.
In a unitary system, the utility of an upper house is highly questionable.
Really?
Yeah. Britain is a unitary state and they have the House of Lords. France has the Senate. But neither of these upper houses has any real veto-wielding power. The lower house can usually override their objections with a simple majority vote.
So why do they even have them?
Historically, these upper houses and unitary systems evolved to represent the aristocracy against the commoners. But today, they function mostly as elderly, prestigious debating societies. Their main practical function is to act as a proofreader.
A proofreader.
Yeah, they might catch a legal typo or a drafting error in a bill that was rushed through the lower house too quickly.
And some unitary countries just looked at their upper houses, looked at the taxpayer bill to maintain them and said, why are we paying for this?
Exactly. The textbook highlights countries like New Zealand, Denmark, and Sweden. They are all unitary systems. In recent decades, they realized their upper houses served no vital constitutional purpose, slowed down legislation, and cost money.
So what did they do?
They undertook constitutional reforms and simply abolished them. They fired half their legislature and became unicameral, or one-chamber systems, and their democracies functioned perfectly fine without them.
Wow, just fired half of them. So whether a country has one chamber or two, where does the actual legislating, the writing of the laws happen?
Okay.
Because if you turn on that C-SPAN broadcast and look at the floor of the U.S. Senate, it's mostly empty speeches.
Yes.
But the textbook is very explicit about this. The bulk of legislative work is not done on the floor. It is done out of sight in committee rooms.
Committees are the actual engines of the legislature. Think about it. In any given session, thousands of bills are introduced.
Right.
If the whole parliament tried to debate every single one on the floor, they would achieve nothing. So the legislature divides itself into specialized committees: agriculture, armed services, foreign affairs.
And they filter everything.
Yes. These committees screen the thousands of bills and pick out the few dozen that actually merit serious consideration. But there is a massive difference in how much power a committee wields depending on whether they are in a parliamentary or presidential system.
Let's expand on an analogy here because I think it perfectly captures the dynamic.
Yeah.
I like to compare the legislature to a massive high-end restaurant.
Okay, I'm listening.
The legislative floor, that grand, majestic chamber with the podium and the cameras, that is just the dining room.
Yeah.
It's where the final plated dish is presented to the public for consumption. But the committee rooms, those are the chaotic, sweating kitchen prep stations. That's where the raw ingredients are chopped, the meat is butchered, the sauces are reduced, and the actual meal is cooked.
It's a very apt analogy. And to follow that logic into the British parliamentary system, the kitchen staff, the parliamentary committees, they are essentially not allowed to change the menu.
Oh, because of the fusion of powers.
Exactly. The cabinet ministers, who are the executive branch, they dictate the legislation. The British Parliament isn't really supposed to reject bills submitted by the government. They are expected to pass them.
So they just do prep work.
Right. So the committees in the UK are relatively weak. They can suggest minor modifications to the seasoning, but they can't throw out the chicken and decide to serve steak instead.
But in the U.S. presidential system, with its strict separation of powers,
In the U.S., the committees are incredibly, almost terrifyingly powerful.
because Congress doesn't owe its existence to the president.
Yes. The congressional committees can take the president's proposed menu, shred it, throw it in the trash, and cook whatever they want. U.S. standing committees are highly developed, fiercely independent fiefdoms.
Wow.
Sitting on a powerful committee, like Ways and Means or Appropriations, it offers immense prestige, it controls billions of dollars, and generates massive media exposure for its members.
But even within that powerful U.S. committee system, the textbook notes that the internal power dynamics have shifted dramatically, specifically pointing to a massive internal revolt in the 1970s.
Yes. For a long time in the U.S. Congress, committee chairs were determined strictly by seniority.
Just whoever had been there the longest.
Exactly. The longest-serving member of the majority party automatically became the chair. Period. You ended up with incredibly powerful, usually very old men who ruled their committees like absolute tyrants.
They could just block anything.
They could single-handedly kill a piece of major national legislation simply by refusing to schedule a hearing for it.
But in the 1970s, a wave of younger members staged a revolt.
They did. They changed the internal rules to allow the party caucuses to hold secret ballot votes for committee chairs, effectively breaking the stranglehold of the seniority system.
They decentralized the power away from the old guard.
They did.
Yeah.
And they shifted a lot of that power down to newly created subcommittees. Subcommittees became easier to establish, and crucially, they got the budget to hire their own independent staffs.
Which sounds more democratic.
It democratized the process, sure, but some political scientists argue it went too far. They worry it fragmented power so much that it became exponentially harder for Congress to act cohesively as a single body.
So the committees and subcommittees are doing all the heavy prep work, chopping the vegetables, writing the actual dense legal wording of the bills, which begs a huge question. What is the rest of the legislature actually doing with its time?
This brings us to a profound, almost existential shift in modern government. The theoretical textbook definition of a legislative body is that they formulate and initiate laws. But the data shows that in practice, actual lawmaking is in severe long-term decline as a legislative function.
The textbook calls this the myth of lawmaking. It explicitly warns us to take the legislature's rule initiation function with a massive grain of salt. Why?
Because modern legislatures increasingly just take their cues from the executive branch. I mean, think about how complex modern society is. Regulating the internet, managing a globalized financial system, dealing with climate change.
Yeah, these aren't things a single representative can just draft on a napkin.
Exactly. What happens now is that vast executive agencies develop an idea, the administration's lawyers draft a massive, highly technical proposal, and then members of the president's or prime minister's party simply introduce that pre-written bill to the legislature.
So the legislature is increasingly just in a reactive posture.
Completely. Even the national budget, which historically was the ultimate power of the purse that justified the legislature's existence, is now largely an annual congressional reaction to a massive budget document originally produced by the White House or the Prime Minister's office.
So if they aren't actually sitting in their offices dreaming up and writing new laws, what are they doing to justify their salaries?
Well, the textbook outlines 4 alternative functions that actually consume the vast majority of a modern legislator's time. First up on that list, constituency work.
Constituency work. Okay, break that down.
This function is massive, and it is growing. Legislators today spend an enormous amount of their time acting as ombudsmen. Now, an ombudsman is a Scandinavian concept. It essentially means a specialist who intervenes directly with the massive faceless bureaucracy of the government on behalf of an individual citizen.
The classic everyday example of this is the constituent who calls their local representative's office and says, "The VA lost my medical paperwork," or "Where's my grandma's missing Social Security check?" or "I need an expedited passport."
Exactly. Modern legislators maintain large staffs, both in the Capitol and back in their home districts, whose entire job is dedicated to handling this casework. When a citizen is getting crushed by government bureaucracy, the legislator steps in, makes a phone call, and fixes it.
It is incredibly powerful retail politics. It shows the voters that their elected representative isn't just giving speeches, but is actually fighting for them personally.
It wins votes, no question.
I understand why that works politically, but I have to push back on the structural logic of this. Isn't there something fundamentally broken about a system where a national leader, someone we elected to steer the entire country, manage the macroeconomy, oversee the military, and deal with global foreign policy, is spending a massive chunk of their time tracking down lost checks and doing local favors?
It's a great point.
Doesn't that completely defeat the purpose of having a national legislature?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are hitting on the exact structural danger the textbook warns about. By transforming themselves into highly paid customer service representatives for their specific local districts, legislators lose the wider national view.
Right.
They literally do not have the time, the energy, or the political incentive to focus on the massive, complex national questions. And because nature abhors a vacuum, the initiative on all those big questions shifts even faster over to the executive branch, which is focused nationally.
So the legislature willingly surrenders its power.
Yeah. But for the individual legislator, this hyperlocal focus is a perfectly rational choice. It is exactly how they lock themselves into power. A constituent might disagree with a representative's vote on foreign policy, but if that representative found they're missing veterans' benefits, that constituent will vote for them for life.
Okay, so constituency work explains a huge chunk of their time. What's next?
The second alternative function is supervision and criticism. Even if they aren't initiating the laws, legislatures can use their platform to critically monitor the executive branch to ensure it is effective, transparent, and incorrupt.
Like the British question hour we talked about.
Exactly. Or in the U.S., congressional committee hearings serve this exact purpose. The textbook notes that aggressively keeping the government on its toes, investigating scandals, and demanding accountability is arguably one of the most vital things a modern legislature can do.
Which bleeds directly into the third alternative function, education. Legislatures have the power to call public attention to problems that the executive might want to keep quiet.
The textbook uses a brilliant historical example here. Senator J. William Fulbright.
Oh, during Vietnam.
Right. In the mid-1960s, he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The executive branch was escalating the Vietnam War, and the public was largely in the dark about the realities on the ground.
So what did he do?
Fulbright used his committee to hold televised hearings, bringing in experts to openly debate and criticize the war effort. He used the structure of the legislature to educate the American public.
That's powerful.
It is. Parliaments create mass demands and shape public opinion precisely through this kind of highly visible debate.
And the fourth function is representation. And what I found fascinating in the text is how much it emphasizes that a large part of representation is purely psychological.
It is deeply psychological. Citizens have a fundamental need to feel that they are represented in the halls of power, that someone is speaking for their values, even if their side loses the final vote.
Right.
When citizens feel completely ignored, the government begins to lose its legitimacy. The textbook cites two very different historical examples of what happens when that psychological need for representation fails.
What's the first one?
First, it points to the Tea Party movement in the United States, which was driven by voters who felt entirely estranged from the Washington establishment and vowed to fiercely take back the government.
And just to clarify, the textbook uses the Tea Party not as a political judgment on their platform, but as a fascinating structural example of a populist reaction like a pressure cooker exploding, when a segment of the population feels structurally unrepresented.
Correct. It's a structural observation. The second example the text provides is much more extreme and systemic: the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa.
Oh, wow, okay.
The whites-only legislature there passed laws that evoked zero support, zero psychological legitimacy, and eventually massive sustained disobedience from the entirely unrepresented black majority.
Because they had no voice.
Exactly. When a legislature fails its most elemental, basic function of representing the people, the entire democratic system cracks and eventually shatters.
But this desperate need to represent local constituents, to keep them happy through casework and visible projects so the legislator can guarantee their reelection, it directly fuels the massive financial dysfunctions we see today.
Yeah.
Let's look at pork, filibusters, and the drive to overspend.
If a legislator's primary rational goal is to act as a local ombudsman and secure their own reelection, the most effective tool they have ever invented is pork barrel politics.
Where does that bizarre term even originate? Pork barrel.
The textbook notes it derives from the pre-Civil War era in the United States. It refers to the practice of plantation owners giving their enslaved people gifts of pickled pork parts distributed directly from a wooden barrel, which would cause a scramble.
Oh, wow, that's dark.
Yeah. But in modern politics, under the much politer, sanitized label of earmarks, it refers to government projects aimed specifically at bringing federal money and physical improvements to a legislator's home district.
We're talking about new highways, bridge repairs, massive military contracts, agricultural subsidies, research grants for local universities.
Exactly, bringing home the bacon. And to get these highly localized projects passed in a massive national legislature, representatives engage in a practice called log rolling.
Log rolling.
It's a simple transactional trade. You help roll my log, and I'll help roll yours. I don't care about the new dam in your district, and you don't care about the new military base in mine, but I will vote for your dam if you vote for my base. We both get to go home and cut a ribbon, and the taxpayers foot the bill for both.
Which leads to a massive, practically unsolvable structural problem: aggregate overspending.
It does.
The textbook makes a really astute, slightly depressing point here. In the abstract, if you poll them, every single legislator is in favor of a balanced budget and fiscal responsibility.
Naturally.
But rationally, their individual self-interest getting reelected by bringing local projects home to their voters drives the aggregate system to massively overspend. What's rational and good for the individual politician is disastrous for the national debt.
And this dynamic is perfectly illustrated by the paradox of the 2010 earmark ban. In 2010, amid outrage over the deficit, the U.S. Congress actually banned earmarks. They outlawed pork barrel spending. It dropped by 98% overnight.
Which sounds on paper like a massive victory for fiscal responsibility.
You would absolutely think so. But the math tells a different story. Earmarks only ever made up about 0.5% of the total U.S. federal budget.
Wait, really? Just 0.5%?
Yeah. Eliminating them was a drop in the ocean. It barely made a dent in the deficit. But the unintended consequence of banning them was catastrophic for the actual legislative process.
Why? If it didn't save that much money, what did it break?
Because without pork, party leaders lost their persuader. Earmarks were essentially legal, highly effective little bribes used by leadership to get stubborn legislators to compromise and support major, necessary, but painful national legislation.
Wow.
Without the ability to trade local favors, lawmakers had no incentive to cross the aisle. They retreated to their ideological corners. The textbook suggests that without the grease of pork barrel spending, much necessary legislation simply grinds to a halt and dies.
Think of pork barrel spending like the basket of free bread they bring to your table at a restaurant before the meal.
Okay, I love this.
Technically, giving away all that bread costs the restaurant extra money, and it's bad for their bottom line. But it keeps everyone at the table happy, chewing, and occupied while they wait for the main course.
Right.
When the restaurant bans the free bread to save a few pennies, everybody gets cranky, nobody can agree on what appetizers to share, the blood sugar drops, and the whole table just ends up fighting with each other.
That is a brilliant analogy. The bread is the grease. And when the table fights in the U.S. Senate, they don't just argue, they use the filibuster.
The rise of the bureaucracy.
Yes. The U.S. Senate rules uniquely allow a member to infinitely debate and block legislation. Historically, this was a rare tool. But today, the only way to end a filibuster is through a vote of cloture, which requires 60 out of 100 votes.
But the Founding Fathers explicitly intended for a simple majority of 51 votes to pass normal laws.
Right, they did. But today, because of the weaponization of the filibuster, the 60-vote minimum has become the de facto norm for absolutely everything.
The numbers in the textbook detailing this escalation are wild. The average annual number of filibusters went from about 3 in the 1950s up to 16 in the 1980s and 90s to well over 100 in recent years. It's exponential growth.
It has essentially paralyzed Congress. It turns the United States into a vetocracy, a system where a deeply entrenched minority can constantly, effortlessly block the will of the majority rule.
And what's truly astonishing is how Congress reacts to its own structural paralysis.
True.
They don't try to fix the rules. They actually try to give away their own constitutional power.
This is one of the most remarkable, counterintuitive insights in the textbook. Because Congress is so deeply divided, and because they know they are structurally incapable of restraining their own log-rolling and spending habits, they repeatedly try to surrender their ultimate constitutional authority, the power of the purse, to the executive branch.
They want the president to do the hard work for them.
Exactly. In 1985, Congress passed a law trying to hand the power to automatically limit spending to an appointed, unelected official.
And what happened?
The Supreme Court stepped in and struck it down, saying Congress couldn't outsource its job.
And then in 1996, they tried to give the power away again with the line item veto.
Right. Congress actively passed a law giving the president the power to take a massive budget bill, pull out a pen, and cross out specific spending items he didn't like without having to veto the entire bill.
That is a massive, unprecedented abdication of legislative power.
It really was. And once again, the Supreme Court had to intervene and throw it out, ruling that the Constitution simply does not allow the president to single-handedly rewrite legislation. As the textbook puts it, Congress essentially threw its hands up in exhaustion and said, "We give up. We're too divided to make the hard choices. Mr. President, you take over our constitutional duties."
But it's not just political division and vetocracies causing the surrender. It is a fundamental, deeply entrenched intellectual mismatch. Let's look at the expertise gap and the 1,000-page bill.
The physical reality of laws today is that they are increasingly, utterly incomprehensible to the people voting on them. In 1948, the average U.S. law was about 2.5 pages long. It was readable.
And today?
Today, the average is 20 pages, and major sweeping legislation is staggering in its length and complexity.
The textbook mentions the 2010 Affordable Care Act being roughly 2,400 pages long, and the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act topping 1,000 pages. Now, just as a reminder, the textbook cites these purely as objective historical examples of modern legislative complexity, not to debate the merits of healthcare or education reform.
Right, totally neutral.
The fundamental point is mathematical. No single human being, no matter how smart, has the physical time to read, digest, and understand 2,400 pages of incredibly dense legal and medical regulations in the few days before a floor vote.
Exactly. They simply vote on summaries. And why are these bills so astronomically long? Partially because managing a modern society is genuinely complex, but largely because legislators, their staffs, and armies of lobbyists use these massive bills as vehicles to slip in countless unrelated, highly technical provisions on behalf of donors and special interest groups.
It brings to mind the famous quote attributed to the 19th century German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. You don't want to know what goes into the making of laws and sausages.
It's so true. The modern legislative process is a massive sausage factory, and the casing is 2,400 pages long.
So what does this all mean for the balance of power? It means lawmakers are routinely voting on massive laws they literally haven't read, relying entirely on brief, highly partisan summaries prepared by 25-year-old staffers. They just don't have the technical expertise to understand the details.
Look at the demographics of a modern legislature. Out of the 535 members of the U.S. Congress, historically more than half of them have been lawyers. European parliaments have slightly different makeups, more teachers, journalists, and civil servants.
But almost nowhere in the democratic world do you find legislatures populated by elected technical experts or military strategists or epidemiologists or environmental scientists.
Right.
So when it comes time to write a law regulating complex medical care or the intricacies of artificial intelligence or highly leveraged banking practices,
They are completely hopelessly outmatched. They do not know how artificial intelligence works, so they have to rely on the specialists who work permanently in the executive branch departments.
the executive agencies have the scientists and the economists.
Exactly. Those executive experts end up drafting the technical legislation, bringing it to the committee, and testifying as the ultimate authorities. The lawyers in the legislature just nod along.
But wait, I know the U.S. Congress has its own experts. They don't just rely on the president's scientists, do they?
The U.S. Congress does have its own experts, and it is a fascinating, unique exception globally. Because of the separation of powers and the deep institutional jealousy between the branches, the U.S. Congress created its own independent, nonpartisan research arms to try and keep up.
Oh, like the alphabet soup agencies.
Right. They built the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, the Congressional Research Service, the CRS, and the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. No other legislature in the world has anything even close to this level of independent research capability.
But even with all those three-letter agencies feeding them data,
Even with them, Congress still cannot counterbalance the massive information and expertise advantage of the millions of highly specialized employees working in the executive branch. A few thousand congressional researchers simply cannot outthink the entire Pentagon, the EPA, and the Treasury combined. The executive branch holds the monopoly on information, and information is power.
which finally brings us full circle to the image we started with, the empty chamber and the career politician.
Yeah.
Given absolutely everything we've just discussed, they are intellectually outmatched by the executive branch's experts. They are completely paralyzed by structural gridlock or the fear of immobilism, and they are spending all their waking hours back in their districts acting as customer service reps to ensure their reelection. It is no surprise whatsoever that the physical, majestic legislative chambers have become ghost towns.
Absenteeism is a global legislative phenomenon. It's not just an American problem. Most of the time, members simply do not need to be physically present on the floor.
Because the passionate speeches being given to the empty mahogany desks aren't going to change a single colleague's mind.
Right, everyone already knows exactly how the party whips have instructed them to vote. Those floor speeches are purely theatrical. They are performed entirely for the television cameras to be chopped up into 15-second clips for the mass media and social media back home.
The textbook gives some hilarious and frankly slightly depressing examples of how different countries structurally accommodate this absenteeism. I know you said it's global, so how does a highly efficient country like Sweden handle it?
In Sweden's Riksdag, they embraced the reality and installed a highly efficient electronic voting system. The members don't sit in the chamber listening to the debate.
Where are they?
They are in their offices meeting lobbyists or doing committee work. When it's finally time to vote, a chime summons them from all over the building. They rush in, press their ja or nej button at their desk, look at the giant electronic tally board, which they already knew the outcome of anyway, and then they immediately turn around and leave.
Wow.
The grand chamber is full for barely 10 minutes.
And France. How do they handle an empty room?
In the French National Assembly, they developed a system of proxy voting that is incredibly stark. A single junior member of a party will literally walk down the rows of empty desks on the floor, physically flicking the voting switches for all their absent colleagues exactly as the party leadership instructed.
Desk flicking. That is wild. The Evening News might report that a major national law passed by a vote of 300 to 200, but there might have only been 36 actual human beings in the room when it happened.
It happens all the time.
And what about the U.S.? We don't have proxy voting like that on the floor, right?
The U.S. House and Senate generally require members to be physically present to cast a vote, but they developed a workaround called pairing.
Pairing. How does that work?
If a member knows they're going to be absent, they can arrange to be formally paired with another absent member who holds the exact opposite view on the bill.
Oh, I see.
Their two phantom votes officially cancel each other out. The mathematical outcome of the bill isn't affected. And both absent members get to go back to their constituents and say, I took a firm stand on this issue, even though neither of them was within 100 miles of the Capitol.
This raises a really important cynical question, though. Does this blatant absenteeism just mean our elected officials are incredibly lazy? Are they just skipping work?
Not necessarily. In fact, most of them work grueling hours. As we discussed, they're incredibly busy with committee markups, fundraising, meeting with interest groups, and helping constituents with lost checks. But their physical absence from the central chamber is an implicit, devastating institutional admission. By not being in the room where it happens, they are openly admitting that debating ideas and passing laws on the floor of the legislature is simply no longer their primary job.
And yet, despite all this structural dysfunction, despite the gridlock and the surrender of power, they never leave. Parliamentarians have transformed into career politicians.
The lack of turnover in modern legislatures is staggering. In U.S. House of Representatives races, historically over 90% of incumbents who seek re-election win.
90%.
They possess massive, almost insurmountable structural advantages. They have gerrymandered districts specifically drawn to protect their party. They have 100% name recognition. They have immense campaign war chests funded by interest groups who want access. And they have the deep loyalty of all those voters they helped as local ombudsmen.
It makes me think of Alexander Hamilton. The textbook points out that Hamilton, when defending the Constitution, confidently predicted that the short 2-year term for the House of Representatives would ensure constant rapid turnover.
Yes, he did.
He thought it would guarantee that the House would always perfectly reflect the immediate shifting passions of the people.
Hamilton was a genius, but that specific prediction was deeply flawed. He couldn't possibly have foreseen the modern, industrialized machinery of incumbency. Ironically, turnover is often slightly higher in the Senate, which was the chamber specifically designed by the founders to be the elite, insulated, slow-moving body.
That's ironic.
But this lack of fresh blood across the board makes legislatures stodgy, deeply risk-averse, and incredibly slow to innovate.
Is the European model any better with turnover?
Mm-hmm.
Because they use proportional representation, right? Does that help?
Not really, because of how proportional representation, or PR, mathematically functions in practice. PR systems generally rely on party lists. When you vote for the party, not the person.
And who writes that list?
The senior party leaders. They put their own names at the very top of the list, guaranteeing that as long as the party wins even a fraction of the vote, the senior leadership gets a seat. Young, fresh, innovative candidates are put at the very bottom of the list, where they have almost zero mathematical chance of entering parliament.
So it's still career politicians.
Mostly. However, PR systems do have one distinct structural advantage over the U.S. system. They do allow new, smaller fringe parties to eventually break into the legislature if they cross a certain threshold.
Like who?
The textbook notes how in the 1980s, the green ecology parties utilized the PR system to enter several European parliaments, bringing totally new, radical environmental ideas to the forefront that the major parties were ignoring.
But even if a few new ideas manage to squeak in, the legislature as an institution suffers from a massive, fatal psychological disadvantage compared to the executive branch. And the textbook calls this president worship.
Yes. Human beings, sociologically and psychologically, seem to have a deep primal need to respond to a single unifying chief. We want a leader. A single person, a president or a strong prime minister, can project charisma, decisive strength, and calm in a crisis. The textbook points out that American children are socialized almost from birth to revere the president as a sort of benevolent parental figure who is personally guiding the destiny of the nation.
But a legislature, a legislature can't hug a baby or project singular strength.
Exactly. A legislature, by its very design, cannot have charisma. It speaks with a divided, squabbling, chaotic voice. It is 535 people constantly pointing out each other's flaws, arguing over procedural rules on television, and airing the country's dirty laundry.
It's no wonder that the public looks at the legislature with disdain while simultaneously worshiping the singular executive. The executive looks like action, the legislature looks like an argument.
Perfectly said.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, pulling back the curtain on how these institutions actually operate. Let's quickly recap the journey we've taken.
It's been a long journey.
We started deep in the Middle Ages, with ambitious, desperate monarchs trading away a fraction of their absolute power to nobles in exchange for tax revenue giving birth to the very concept of the legislature and the leverage of the power of the purse.
Right.
We saw how that historical accident eventually split into two distinct operating systems: the fast-moving but incredibly fragile parliamentary systems, and the stable but permanently, intentionally gridlocked presidential systems.
Two very different solutions.
We explored how actual laws aren't really written by lawmakers anymore, but by executive bureaucrats and specialized experts. While our elected officials spend their days doing local favors, begging for pork barrel projects and staring blankly at 1,000-page bills, they physically do not have the time to read.
And finally, we saw how all of this culminates in those majestic, empty legislative chambers filled with career politicians who have steadily, willingly surrendered their constitutional power to chief executives.
It is a profoundly sobering trajectory. The original Lockean ideal, the Enlightenment philosophy that the legislature, as the direct voice of the people, should be the supreme branch of government, has slowly, inexorably eroded away under the pressures of modern complexity.
It really has.
But I truly hope that the next time you, the listener, see a 15-second news clip of an empty legislative chamber on C-SPAN, or you hear about another looming government shutdown or a collapsed parliamentary coalition in Europe, you won't just roll your eyes and change the channel. You will actually understand the deep, structural, centuries-old architectural forces that are playing out right in front of you behind the scenes.
And to leave you with something to truly mull over long after this finishes, the textbook outlines a historical event it calls the Russian dilemma, which I think perfectly encapsulates the terrifying paradox of the modern democratic age.
What exactly happened in the Russian dilemma?
In the 1990s, Russia was attempting a massive, unprecedented transition out of Soviet communism and toward democracy. The economy was absolutely collapsing, people were suffering, and vast, urgent structural reforms were needed immediately to save the country.
High stakes.
Very high stakes. But they experienced a massive, insurmountable deadlock between the executive, President Boris Yeltsin, and the Russian legislature, the Duma. The Duma was heavily dominated by his political opponents, and they systematically blocked every single reform he tried to pass.
Complete existential gridlock when the country could least afford it.
Exactly. The system froze. And to solve this gridlock, to get complex, desperately needed things done quickly, the system eventually snapped. Vladimir Putin eventually took total centralized control, founding a dominant political party that completely neutered the Duma, turning it back into a rubber stamp.
He just bypassed it.
He solved the inefficiency. The trains ran on time. But in doing so, Russia definitively ceased to be a democracy. It illustrates the ultimate terrifying paradox we face today.
What's the paradox?
To get incredibly complex things done quickly in a modern globalized world, power must be concentrated in the hands of a single decisive executive. But to remain a free, representative democracy, power must be dispersed, divided, and inherently painfully slow.
Wow. So we leave you with this final provocative thought to explore on your own. In a relentlessly fast-moving, incredibly complex 21st century world, a world of artificial intelligence, global pandemics, and instantaneous financial crises, is it still actually possible to have a government that delivers both rapid efficiency and true democracy? Or are we inevitably being forced by the sheer speed of the modern world to choose just one?